Okay, we'll get started. So hopefully you can all see the right screen. Nods from my team. Yep. Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us this evening for our Home Retrofit Heating and Powering Your Home webinar. Just a quick reminder that we're recording this session and it's going to be available afterwards on our website. This is our third webinar on home retrofit. Going to be covering heating and powering your home. So my name is Kath. I help to manage Warmer Sussex along with Natasha, who's also going to be keeping an eye on the chat and your questions this evening. Do you say hi, Natasha?
Hi there.
Just going to say a little bit about Warmer Sussex. So we're a one-stop shop for homeowners across Sussex who want to make their homes warmer, healthier, more energy efficient. We're part of RetrofitWorks, which is a not-for-profit not-for-private cooperative of energy efficiency experts and local contractors. So this evening, unfortunately, Home Energy were due to be attending, but they're not able to, unfortunately. However, I'm very pleased that tonight we're going to be joined by my colleague, Warren Pope. Just say hi, Warren.
Hello, everyone.
So Warren's got loads of experience in the energy efficiency industry, particularly in technology consultancy for the selection of renewable technology, energy management and retrofit. So he is absolutely more than qualified to give you an overview of the topics we're going to be covering tonight. So just a quick reminder on the housekeeping elements. We are recording this session, as I said at the beginning. And as we go through, as Warren and myself talk this evening, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat, and then we've got time at the end. We should have a good 20 minutes or so at the end to go through all those questions. And if we don't have enough time to answer them, then we will answer them afterwards, and we will send you an email after the event with a copy of the presentation and the questions, any answers that we didn't get to during this evening. So please do ask away. So I'm just going to start by giving a little bit of context on home retrofit and why it's important. And then Warren's going to dive into the renewables, covering air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, solar thermal, solar PV and batteries. So I think we're covering quite a lot tonight. But it's going to be a really good overview of how you can use renewables to improve the energy efficiency of your home. So just to start with, give a little bit of context, why bother with retrofit? So the homes in the UK today produce 20% of the UK's carbon dioxide emissions and use 35% of its energy. So this is modelling from the Climate Change Committee, which is the independent statutory body that advises the government on targets and reports on progress. Progress on energy generation, on decarbonising electricity generation has been good, which is why moving to electricity as a kind of heating source has been a priority for a while. But it's still really important that we improve the energy efficiency of homes across the UK. The housing stock is old, it's generally inefficient, and at the moment, fossil fuel heating is used in the majority of houses, be that gas or oil. And as we know, it's still being installed in lots of new builds and will be for a couple of years yet. So we need to ensure that we're looking at how we improve the energy efficiency of our housing stock, as 80 to 85% of today's homes will still be standing in 2050, which is when we've set ourselves our target in the UK to be net zero. So what is retrofitting? So it's adding or changing something that makes your home more energy efficient, warmer, healthier, and also reduces your energy bill. So it can be a change to the interior or the exterior of your home in terms of insulation, energy efficient lighting, and appliances, improving the windows, improving the controlled ventilation. and then more efficient heating. So insulation and ventilation and improving those elements of your home, we covered on a previous webinar. So if you missed those, you can find them on our website. So you don't feel like you miss out. We've got a beginner's guide to retrofit, which tells you more about the how to and how to plan your retrofit, as well as the insulation, ventilation. So you'll find them on our website. They're also on our YouTube channel. And we'll add tonight's webinar to that as well in the next day or two. So now I'm going to hand over to Warren. Warren, did you want to say anything before we start the video? Or do you want me to charge ahead?
I think if we start with the video, and then I can run through after that once the everyone's seen the basic concept. Okie dokie.
And apologies for the music. It's not ours. I'll just let it run. It's only short.
Right, great. Next slide, please. Right, air source heat pumps can come in two ways. They can be air to air or air to water. The air to air heat pump actually resembles very much like a air conditioning unit would, and it would actually heat with hot air. However, in the United Kingdom, typically it's the air to water mode that are used most of all. As the animation said, they will work down to minus 15 degrees. They might have to work a little bit harder to pull the heat out, but they can still be quite effective. An important thing to mention when considering the heat pump is that the outside unit will, as you've seen in the animation, will draw the fresh air in, and it draws it in from the back of the unit and from the sides, and then it expels the cold air the same way that you would with a fridge, but in reverse, coming up what you see as the front side of the panel. It's very important to consider the positioning of the outdoor unit to make sure that it has plenty of space to bring in the fresh air. It's unfortunately very common to see areas where there are bins, pot plants stacked around them. I've even been in some sites where you've actually got weeds that are growing up and being pulled in by the fans inside with them. All that will do is damage the unit. It will overstress the motor, and again, it will need to make it work extra hard in order to get the heat out that you need. Generally, with the heat pumps, for 1 kilowatt of energy that's consumed going in, you will get 3 kilowatts of energy coming out. The reason for this is because of the compression of the heat transfer fluid. It's compressed to quite a high pressure, and that when it then expands, when it gets out the other side, the reaction within that creates additional heat, and therefore the energy benefit comes through. With a conversion of 1 to 3 of that view, air source heat pumps are a really good swap. If anyone is on heating oil, LPG, anything like that, where it's about the 15p, 20p a litre, then aside from the carbon emission savings, it can also make a huge financial saving. Next slide, please. Now, in the images here, the top right-hand side, courtesy of Busy Energy, that is the hot water cylinder for a air-to-water air source heat pump. And as you can see, it is very highly insulated all the way around. Again, it's not that common to actually see installations like this, but this is taking best practice to as good as it can be. And this is what is known as a monoblock air source heat pump that's on display. I'll explain more about that in a moment. Generally speaking, your average gas or oil burner will typically put hot water out at around about 80 degrees temperature. A heat pump will release the water out of it around about 55, 60 degrees, so a little bit lower. This means that certain areas might have to be modified slightly. If you have underfloor heating, the air source heat pump is actually perfect temperature for running the underfloor heating. It will go really well. If you wish to continue with radiators, it is most certainly possible, but we then need to think about upgrading the radiators. Potentially, most UK houses will have what's known as a single skin radiator. It might mean that we need to put a double skin in, so you've got two joined together, and then also make them a little bit longer. We also need to give some thought to the size of the pipework and where the pipework runs within the building. Some heating systems can be on a micro bore, which is around about 6 or 8 mil or 15 millimeters in diameter. Ideally, the heat pump will work well under a 20 millimeter diameter because it needs to get as much of the water that it can that's heated round, and then to also soak the heat into the radiators to make sure that we can get the heat out into room. This does also mean that with a gas boiler, typically you might be able to warm your house up within about 30 minutes of turning it on. With the heat pump activating, it might take sort of an hour to 2 hours to get the building warm. So generally with a heat pump, it's pretty much best practice to leave the heating on for longer, but at a lower temperature, so you can create a nice stable temperature within the building and moving along. Now, there is the RHI payment, which is the Renewable Heat Incentive. It's quite possible to claim that to help cover the cost of the heat pump that we have. However, you need to have a specific design, and it needs to be authorized by the MCS certification service. So on the slide, you'll see that the MIS 3005 design is required. That's most important when talking to the contractor to make sure that they do all the proper design paperwork. And one other consideration is also for whether you're in a conservation area. That might have some impact onto where you might be able to place your outer unit because they might not like to sit at the front. Typically, the one that we've got on display, the monoblock, would normally go straight outside the building within about 1 meter, 2 meters possibly, or a couple of yards if you like. There is another option which is called the split system. With that, the outside unit can be as much as 30 meters away from the house, and then you have the other part that does the compression will actually go next to where the hot water cylinder is. So if you've got a complicated building or a building that has perhaps a large basement or a utility area where you can put the equipment in, then that would be perfectly feasible to be used there. The heat pumps will come in sizes which vary from 4.5 kilowatts up to 14 kilowatts with sort of 5, 6, 8.5 and 11.2 in between. Depending on the amount of energy that's needed to heat the building, you can either have just one unit or you can actually attach the units together in order to get them up to the required heat output to keep the house nice and warm. Next slide, please. Now, typically with the heat pumps, as you can see from the screen, the pump itself can actually last for a good 20 to 25 years. The typical cost of a average size pump for your average size house probably would be in the region of about £12,000, which might make you wince to begin with. But when you consider in the renewable heat incentive payment, there is potential to get £10,000 over a 7-year period, which then would actually bring the price of the unit down to just around about £2,000, which is not far off what a typical gas boiler would be. Now, there are a few myths with heat pumps. Previously, it has to be said, some of them were incredibly noisy. There are now models out now that are actually super quiet. You can have them outside underneath your kitchen window and you won't be able to hear it through the double glazing, which is something. There's also quite a few people that have heat pumps that say they've become more expensive than what the heating was beforehand. With the heat pump, it's important to make sure that everything is set up correctly. While it's working and doing the heating, because you've got hot water at about 55, 60 degrees, there is a Legionella risk. So it's built into the system that every so often it will do a purge. It will heat up super high to make sure there's no chance of any Legionella occurring. And I also was checking this morning to say that there has never, ever been a case of Legionella in any domestic hot water system going around. So it proves that it works. One other thing is, typically the hot water cylinders will have 2, possibly 3 immersion heaters in, probably around at about 3 kilowatts each. If people are pressing the boost button to try and get a bit of extra heat out, that will actually turn all of the immersion heaters on at the same point in time, which will then really ramp up the energy consumption. And this is another area where people have not been aware as to what the boost button will do, which then causes increased cost. Oh, and typically, yeah, within the UK, it is the Monoblock air source heat pump, which is typically used. Next slide, please. Now, with the ground source heat pump, it does work by either having a borehole. In the picture, the formal name is ground loops, but in the industry, typically most people call them a slinky, because it's pretty much like the old slinky toy, if you're old enough to remember, that you used to have, that you could drop down the stairs and it would go all the way. Now, ordinarily, if you're using a slinky, you'd put it in around about 1.5 meters, somewhere underneath the ground. However, if you're in the north of Scotland, where it's going to get really cold and you're going to get the permafrost is going to sink in quite deeply, then you would need to go a fair bit deeper. Generally speaking, the temperature is round about 6 degrees once you get far enough down, and it's stable. So if you have perhaps a larger building, you're perhaps in a colder area, by having a ground source heat pump, you can have a relatively good sense of heat all the year round, because you're going to get that constant temperature of the earth, giving the insulation and the protection. Oh, next slide, please. Now, for the site requirements, there is a fair bit of kit that comes with these, as you can see in the photograph on the right-hand side. If using a borehole instead of the slinky for getting the heat out of the ground, there is an additional cost to that, and it can be quite expensive. There is also some considerations that have to be had as to what the soil is, as to where the borehole is going to go in. Typically, loose, gravelly, sandy soil means that you don't get good heat transfer. If you've got fairly nice solid soil, even some clay, then you can actually get quite a good heat transfer out of that when the borehole goes in. It is difficult to provide too much of an estimate as to exact costs, which is why there are ranges. Depending on the sizing of the heating unit for the building will depend on the depth of the borehole that you need. So potentially you could have one borehole in one house that being 15 meters deep. In other buildings, you might even have to go as much as 122 meters down. Again, depending on the sizing, it might mean that you might need to have 2 or even possibly 3 boreholes done if you've got a really large building that needs quite a large amount of heating supply for it. With the ground source heat pump, again, it's eligible for the renewable heat incentive, but with the ground source, you can actually get quite a larger amount, as it shows in the slide on the bottom. Depending on the size of the unit, you could get up to £30,000 over 7 years. That again will probably just about pay for the cover of a average ground source heat pump with an average amount of boreholes. So it really depends to a certain extent on the size of the budget and also to the availability of the land. Right, next slide, please. With the solar thermal, there are actually 3 types available for sale in the UK. However, one of them, which is a thermodynamic, that is normally used in warmer countries, you can't get renewable heat incentive with it, so it doesn't actually sell particularly well. So we're going to have a focus just on the 2 that we've got in the images. So the top is an evacuated tube, and the one on the bottom is a flat plate solar connector. Personally, I think they are an undervalued product. Whilst they are not in a position to give you all of your hot water, they can certainly help towards it. And even in winter, they can still generate a certain amount of heat. And that means instead of perhaps taking your water up from as it comes into the tank, say perhaps just a couple of degrees, if the solar thermal can heat it up just 5-10 degrees, that will then reduce the amount of energy that you need from your main heating system to then take it to the rest of the way of what you need to be with hot water. Let's just make sure I'm not getting too far ahead of myself. The evacuated tube is the most efficient out of the two. Generally speaking, it has a 90% efficiency rate, with the flat plate solar connector, I believe, being closer to the 70-80% efficiency. But again, it depends on the area and space that you have. The ideal will be if you could put it on the roof in a nice shiny spot, but both of these products can actually be ground mounted if you have a garden or something, or field even nearby, which is sufficiently big enough that you have access to where it can keep them safe. Now, a typical tube solar collector could be anywhere between £3,000 to £5,000 to purchase. They can develop between 1,000 to 2,500 kilowatt hours of heat for the hot water. Most of the manufacturers give a range of saying it's between 40 to 60% of your hot water. So if you think that you might be able to get 50% of the hot water done over the year, that's actually not too bad, really. They work by having some form of either refrigerant inside or a heat transfer medium. The evacuated tube is typically water and glycol. The flat plate, generally speaking, is actually going to be sort of a refrigerant type, although even that can vary, which I'll get into when we move to the next slide. So next slide, please. So what we have is, with the evacuated tube, you have the medium is pointing down. It gets superheated by the sun. You have a large glass tube with a smaller glass tube inside. So there is a vacuum put in between the two glass tubes. So it's pretty much going to resemble a typical vacuum flask that you might have to put your hot drink in to take around with you. And then the heat transfer medium actually goes in the middle, and that will be inside a copper tube. The glass is going to be sort of coated on the inner tube with chemicals that really attract the sunlight and really pull it all in and pull the heat in to make it as hot as possible. The medium from the bottom will then sort of convert to steam. The steam will rise to the top. It then goes around a heat exchanger. Typically, it will be a copper pipe, which has got the potable water actually running through it. As the steam hits the pipe, it will heat the water up inside. As the steam cools down, it will then turn to vapor, and then into droplets and condensate, and then it will just run down back to the bottom of the tube again, and it will keep on going. And there'll be a little pump running the potable water through the heat exchanger in order to keep it going. It could be a pump that is connected to the mains electricity, and some suppliers might actually supply a small photovoltaic plate, so it can actually use the sunlight to then pump the water around. The flat plate collector is slightly different. You've got two options. You can either actually run the potable water, the stuff that you would drink, actually through the flat plate in one side, out the other, and then collect the heat. You can get them either with the sides and the back being metal or polymer. The top layer is going to be glass, again coated with a particular substance in order to really heat up as quickly as possible. There can be an issue with the metal casing ones that there is potential for them to freeze on a really cold session. The polymer ones would be a better bet. At the same point in time, you could also have a system where you have a heat transfer medium that actually runs through, and it will go through the flat plate back into the loft, and then it will go through a heat exchanger, and then that will then go and put the hot water into the cylinder. Oh, and what I did, as I've just realized, didn't mention when I was talking about the air source and the ground source heat pumps earlier. When it comes to checking the cylinders, there are many different types that you can have. if you think that you're going to want to have solar thermal, you need to make sure that the cylinder is specified so it has access for a sort of a coil heat exchanger to go in to actually put the heat in that you're getting from the PV tube. But again, a good contractor will be able to run through this with you. Next slide, please. Right. For the solar PV, it's probably one of the items that the most people are familiar with. There are several different types that you can get, probably up to 7, but the generally using their sort of silicon material that runs through. When the light shines in, it knocks the electrons loose within all the silicon, and the movement of them coming loose then actually generates the electricity, which then can be pulled through. The panels are actually made up of individual modules. They're all connected in to make an array. And then that is how the electricity is generated. It's generated into a direct current, which is the sort you get from a battery. It then needs to be converted with an inverter to then put it into alternating current or AC to then actually go into the house's electricity system. It is possible to get solar tiles and solar slates to move in. They are not as efficient as actually having a panel, but they would actually cost an awful lot more than it would be having the system paneled. Now, in the bottom photograph on the right hand side, well, I suppose even the top one, as you can see, they are all actually sitting on top of the roof. It is actually possible to get panels now that are sort of in line with the roof tiles, so they're not quite so noticeable. As a general rule of thumb, the better it looks, the more expensive it's going to get. At the current moment in time, you're probably looking at about £800 per kilowatt generated. However, as a general rule of thumb, for your average 4-bed detached house, you should be able to put enough PV on there to generate about 4.2 kilowatt hours of electricity. And that's also known as kilowatts peak, because as the sun will vary, the amount of energy generated will vary as well. On average, a typical, I suppose, 4-bed house without children or energy hogging would use about 3,600 kilowatts per year. Our house, as it happens, is closer to the 4,500 because of the people in it using lots of electrical devices. And because I put it on the slide, you've got the most 3 common types of PV that I mentioned there, with the monocrystalline, polycrystalline. You can also get the thin film. Now, as running along the line on the slide, the monocrystalline is the best performing. The thin film is probably the worst performing. But I say that in the fact that it's just with the amount of energy that it's not a bad product. It's suitable for those where you might have a very light roof line where it can't take the weight. So it can still generate electricity, but just perhaps not as much as one of the more premium areas that there are. Now, there used to be the fixed tariff, the feed-in scheme that there was, where you actually got paid for generating electricity. That was stopped some time ago. However, there is now the SEG, or the Smart Export Guarantee. So if you want to, any excess electricity that's not used can be exported direct to an energy provider, where they will make a payment from. The payment from it, I think, still varies slightly depending on who the energy provider is. Next slide, please.
Just at past now.
Yep, sorted. Now, the ideals for having PV is if you can have a roof with a pitch angle of about 30 or 40 degrees. In fact, as it says on the slide, south facing. You can go not south facing, sort of east and west, but anything that goes on a north face really is going to be wasted money, as it won't get enough sunlight to generate sort of the power that's required. However, also same as the solar thermal, these can also be ground mounted if you have the space, and certainly some commercial areas are now actually putting these into carports, so you can actually park your car underneath the PV You're protected from the harsh weather when it's raining, and you're also still generating electricity as well. The picture on the top right-hand side is one of a generic inverter that you might have in your loft, and then with the cabling running through to take the energy where it needs to be. The picture on the bottom right-hand side, the big black box on the left-hand side is actually a stack of batteries, which we're going to move on to next. But that is actually from an off-grid building where they're actually attempting to harvest all of the electricity that they use by themselves. That battery stack will be eye-wateringly expensive to purchase and to put in, but it just shows that you can really have as many batteries as you would like or could afford, as the case may be, and they can just be put in series in order to help with the generation of the power. The other thing to consider with the PV panels is, again, some areas may require you to have planning permission, or you might be able to put them on as your permitted development for the dwelling. But certainly it will be worthwhile doing the check before, certainly signing any orders. Next slide, please. Now, for the batteries, it really is a specialist subject to run through what is going to be most suited for each environment. Their lifespan and capacity will all vary, and it's all down to the amount of charge up and discharge cycles that the battery will enable to endure. The most popular or well known at the moment are as it says here, the Tesla, the Powervault, but also for those of you that are familiar with the Nissan Leaf electric car, when the cars have lost their peak with the battery, you can now actually get the car batteries that are repurposed to then become a storage system for the property that it goes into. Now, with the PV and the battery system, you can have a on-grid system or off-grid system. Now, with the on-grid, you can export your excess electricity and go back to the grid and everything else. But in the event of a power cut, the inverter will turn everything off. If you have an off-grid system, then if you have a power cut, you'll still be able to use all the electricity from the batteries while no one else is running. But it does also mean if you're off-grid, then you can't export the electricity out. The reason for having the either on-grid or the off-grid is that when you've got the power workers that are actually out on the mains trying to find out where the fault is, if you've got a system either with PV or with battery that's on-grid, it will still actually put electricity back into the grid. So that would basically mean they could be electrocuted and killed. So that's why you've got to have the either or rather than with the mix that there is. There are 3 to 4 different types of medium inside the batteries, but really much anything you're going to get is either going to be the lithium ion or a lead acid battery of that type. So without a doubt, by all means, I would certainly recommend you think about batteries for storing electricity. There is potential at some point in the future that tariffs might move to a point of use tariff, where in one day you might actually have 4 or 5 different tariffs to encourage you to do charging of electric vehicles at a certain time of day. And at that point in time, having the battery set to charge up when the electricity is at the lowest price, if it's not been topped up enough by PV, actually will be quite a good idea. Next slide, please. Here we have the list of the different various bodies that there are that can give advice and guidance, in particular with the renewable heat calculator. And now, originally, the renewable heat incentive was actually due to end January this year, but it's been extended. So it's now going to be running until the end of March 2022. And the government are looking to put in something called the Clean Heat Grant to start from April 22. So it's still actually possible to get a claim in for renewable heat incentive, which will certainly help with paying for the cost of the different units that you might be interested in. Next slide, please. So there are other schemes that are available. The Greens Home Grant has made the press quite a bit recently. Lots of the local authorities will actually do their own individual schemes. In particular, there are lots of warm home schemes for those that are on a lower income, where people can go in advice. They can help with switching energy contracts to get the best value contract that there is. There's also help to get insulation installed, which is the eco, and then the LAD scheme, which the acronym escapes me for the current moment in time. That is also, again, to help with the introduction of heat pumps to different areas. We've covered the renewable heat incentive. As it says on the screen, heat pumps, solar thermal, biomass boilers are all under that. And then there are a number of mortgage companies now that are being encouraged to be a bit more generous when it comes to people that are looking to reduce the carbon of the building that they're purchasing. Next slide, please. So thank you everyone for your time. We've now reached the question and answer session.
Yes. Thanks, Warren. That's really, I found that really interesting. Okay. I'm just trying to get myself back into seeing everybody. Tasha, I can't see any questions. I'm not sure what I've done to my screen. Are there any questions in the chat that we can start going through?
No, we haven't had any questions put in the chat yet.
Oh, okay. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask? Let me just see. Has Martin put his hand up? I've got a...
Oh, there we go, from Helen Cook.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, sorry, I lost the spot on my notes. I mentioned that for your average house, it will be about a 4.2 kilowatt array. Generally speaking, it will be somewhere between £6,000 to £7,000. There are some of the areas are doing a bulk buy scheme where they're actually going through local neighbourhoods to actually trying to get thousands rather than hundreds of panels, and then spreading the discount around. But yeah, allow for a typical array, about 4 kilowatts. Yeah, about £6,000.
Excellent. And there's another question there from Andy Arnold. I can see now. I've gained control of my Zoom. So hi, Andy. He says, great presentation, thanks. Is there a minimum energy performance of a property for a heat pump to be effective?
That is actually not an easy one to answer. It will really much depend on the structure of the building and the type, and then how well insulated it's going to be. Certainly the newer 2000 building regs, that should be suitable for either ground or air source heat pump to work on. That will really come down to having a heat loss calculation actually done on the building that you have. The EPC, if you've got one, to give an indication as to how much energy is required in order to heat the house for the year. So it's looking at that. If ideally you'd probably want to be at certainly not much more than 6 kilowatts heat loss for it for the building, or 6,000 kilowatts per year, and that as a general rule of thumb should be okay. But it's really getting the survey done. Now the surveys themselves are quite intensive. It would normally take between 2 and 3 hours somebody to want to go around the house. Everything is measured up. The walls are, well, either inspected or guesstimated where possible to try and work out what sort of the insulation is. Sometimes if you've got a solid stone, call it solid concrete floor, because that will actually retain the heat that's generated and then sort of let it leak out later back into the building to keep it warm, they can be a better performing one than, say, a timber frame building, depending on the amount of insulation that's in the timber frame. So it's really hard to done. And the calculations that you do afterwards, it's about an 8-hour job in actual to get everything fitted into the different units. And then that works out what the sizing of the radiators are that you need. And that is then really the indication as to whether or not a heat pump is going to be suitable.
Thanks, Warren. Next question from Martin. Have you got any opinion on high temperature air source heat pumps?
The market is generally moving towards the low temperature ones. There is a lot of marketing around that says you can fit a high temperature heat pump to an existing radiator system without making any changes whatsoever. I've spoken to my colleagues about this. There is a very high risk if the bore of your water transfer pipe is too small, it can actually pressure the motor and put the motor under pressure as it's trying to force everything through, and then actually damage the motor within the heat pump itself. So based on those that are actually in the field actually going out to fit the units, I would recommend going for a low temperature rather than a high temperature one. And also, if I don't think the high temperature heat pump is eligible for a renewable heat incentive.
Okay, thanks, Warren. Next question from R. Hansen, asking, can you give a guesstimate on the ground space required for the Slinky ground source heat pump?
Well, that will depend on the amount of heat loss that the building is, and then what the heat capacity is that you need at the building. Off the top of my head, I don't have a Scooby-Doo for that. So what I'm going to do is I'll make notes.
Yeah, we can answer that one, can't we?
Yeah, and I can
afterwards.
Yeah, I can have a chat with a few people and then try and get a few estimates for a typical size sort of kilowatt heater, and then try and base that to like an average size building.
Brilliant. Thanks, Warren. So next question from Neil. How much internal, sorry, we're still writing, Warren. Ask you while you're making a note. We'll make a note.
Yep,
I've got it
cool.
recorded. Yep. How much internal space is generally required for cylinders, pipework, control boxes for air source heat pumps?
Well, there was one of the images we had on the slides was actually a typical airing cupboard size in actual fact. So that must have been about 1 meter by 1.5 meters deep. I've actually been crawling on the floor measuring a cylinder before in a room not far off that size. If you've got a nice compact system and you're using a monoblock unit on the outside, so it does all the compressing on the outside and it's actually just putting the hot water in, you could probably get away with something like a 2 meter square. The main thing is going to be the size of the cylinder that you need to make sure that you've got enough water for the family to use. But there's no reason why the cylinder can't go up, if you like, rather than going wide in order to make sure that you get the space. So thinking about that, probably try and allow for 2 meters in height.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is from Mark Gray Smith. He's asked, so he says, we currently have a ground source heat pump that is approaching 20 years old, serving a listed building. Do you have any recommendations for replacement? And he says, I know the property is not ideal for a heat pump. We inherited the situation when we bought the house.
Is that would that be a replacement system or a replacement heat pump?
You can unmute if you want, Mark. I've let everybody if you want to just, you're still there and you want to clarify.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear
you. Anything, Warren, because like I say, it's really quite old and I think it's quite inefficient, although I'm obviously not an expert. It costs an absolute fortune to run. And it is old and the house is very poorly insulated. So any recommendations as to anything we could do other than insulate the house better?
Yeah. Now, are you radiators or underfloor heating?
Both.
Okay.
We've got underfloor upstairs and radiators downstairs.
Right. Sort of to gain an idea of size, how many bedrooms do you have?
4 bed.
4 bed. Would you say it's like an average detached size sort of thing?
Yeah, it might be slightly larger, but yeah, it's not massive.
Okay. It might be worthwhile giving some thought. I mean, I know I haven't covered it, but a biomass boiler.
Okay.
It's still on the list at the moment. That I think it's 2025, they're going to stop putting gas boilers into brand new buildings. Oh, in your instance, you could still get one in if you wanted to and get it sized. That's going to be, for the moment, about 4 kilowatt or 4p per kilowatt of gas going in. In the decarbonisation scheme, I know there are plans afoot to increase the price of gas to encourage people to go off it and reduce the price of the electricity. It might well be worthwhile giving some thought to a biomass boiler or something like a wood pellet.
Okay, yeah.
Typically, it's about 5p per kilowatt running off the wood pellets. But then also looking at your insulation, as soon as you can do, will be another good thing to do as well. Because again, you could have a nice, wonderful unit going in, but if all the heat's going to leak out, then you're not going to benefit from it.
Yeah. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Warren. Okay, question from Helen. Presumably, you can't do both the Green Homes Grant and the RHI. Would RHI be better financially, or could you use a Green Homes Grant, e.g. for insulation, and RHI for solar or air source heat pump?
As it happens, you could, if you really wanted to, do the Green Homes Grant with the RHI, but then your RHI payment will be reduced because you've had the grant funding from the Green Homes Grant.
Yeah, you can't double dip.
Yeah, so as just described, I would keep the Green Homes Grant totally separate from a heat pump and use it for the insulation and the other bits that you can do, but then do your RHI on the heat pump, because that way you're still, well, potentially you're only going to have to pay £2,000 for it by the time you're finished, which will be a lot better for you to get that money back coming in as regular income than it will be to have it reduced by using the Green Homes Grant.
Yeah, I think the only times potentially would be the right way to do that is if your home has got all the insulation it needs, and or you really need that help with the upfront costs for installing a heat pump.
And to again, depending on what type of insulation you're thinking about, if you're considering external wall insulation and stuff like that, it would be better to put the heat pump in afterwards, because then you can actually just, you haven't got to insulate all the way around the heat pump and the fixings and everything else, and then it should allow the installer to make a nice clean finish, really seal it up, so you've got no issues with it. But again, you would also need to check on your terms and conditions with the insulation people to make sure that you wouldn't void any warranty.
Thanks, that's really helpful. I'm doing like a full renovation, so I can bear that in mind through the insulation, check with them that the heat pump could be put in later.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that you could actually have the wall prepared and everything for where it's going to be for all the pipe work to go in, and they could work around that, perhaps leave a tube that's bunged so they can just put all the stuff through. The other thing to bear in mind, though, if you're going to be doing your windows as well, because the external wall insulation will be proud of where the windows are now, you might also want to think about whether you can actually manage to get the windows done at the same point in time, so you get that nice flush finish. It just depends what you want. Otherwise, you'll just have a bit of a reveal coming in, a little angle piece. But again, it's just thinking about the sequencing of things, and then also making sure that, as I say, none of the other warranties or T's and C's are going to clash.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, we did talk about this a little bit on our last webinar. It's just, yeah, always checking your the warranty and conditions on any insulation that you've had put in place as soon as you start changing that, particularly in the walls. There could be all kinds of disclaimers in there, so it's always worth checking. Okay, another question we've got from Martin Rains. Have you an opinion on hybrid heat pumps? He's put in brackets oil. I ask this because my large 250-year-old house has a large heat demand, even though all reasonable measures have been taken to restrict heat loss.
Yeah, I was looking into hybrid heaters a while back. My opinion is guided by the fact that there are only 2 or 3 people that appear to be manufacturing them, and I'm not aware of anyone in the last 5 years that has actually bought one or actually has one in use. So I would tend probably to steer away from a hybrid heating device.
Okay.
And again, actually, biomass might be another thing to consider. I mean, again, depending on the type of property, where it is, you can get the smaller versions where you fill it up by a bag, or you might even be able to have a hopper somewhere. So if it's really big, really old, yeah, then actually having something like an automated fed, again, there's going to be quite a bit of cost to that, but with the renewable heat incentive, it might make it worthwhile considering. Oh, and the other thing actually might be, if you're not using all of the space all of the time, perhaps actually think about combining with some infrared heaters. Now, normally when I mention infrared, people go, what? Because they haven't heard of it. Typically, I would go for a German or an Austrian brand. They are expensive, but they are far better than some of the cheaper ones that you can go and get if you go to Screwfix or somewhere similar. One of the companies that I've worked with closely is a company by the name of Arc Thermal. I've actually seen their product. It's very good, very well made. The other brand is Herschel, which is the main one which is around. But I believe they've now started having their product made in China, and they're beginning to see some defects coming through with those. Again, you need to make sure that you get the right type of infrared product suitable for your room. Now, infrared, they heat thermal mass, they heat people, they heat bodies. Now, if you've got a very leaky building, if you've got traditional heating, you're heating the air, and then the air will flow out with the heat going with it outside of the building. Because the infrared is heating just the people itself, it's literally like a cone of heat. So literally, you could have one on the ceiling. For example, you could be stood in one part of the room and not feel the heat, walk over, and then you're going to be bathed in heat and nice and toasty. They do need to be sequenced so that you get good coverage of the room, but they also literally very low voltage. So where you might have, for example, a 1 kilowatt fan heater, the equivalent infrared would only be using 300 watts. So it's about two-thirds less energy. So you could reduce the amount that you use your main heating in parts of the building, and then rely on the secondary heating such as infrared in order to keep you warm and toasty if you're only using it for a little while. Herschel have a reasonably long warm-up time. Arc Thermal are slightly better, but I do say only slightly. But even that being said, you know, within 30 seconds to a minute, you'll be feeling the heat coming through.
Okay, thanks, Warren. So the next question from Martin. So air source heat pumps. How far from a neighbour's boundary does an air source heat pump have to be sited? Also, how far from the house wall? They sometimes look like they're right up against the house.
Well, for the house wall bit, generally speaking, you probably want to be about metric. So 150 mil, half a foot out. It will very much depend on for how far from the wall what the installation instructions say. That will no doubt vary between different bits, but yeah, without a doubt, you're going to want to have at least half a foot. There is a sound conditioning requirement that there is in decibels for the placement of it, and it's also required in order to get the certificate that you need to get the RHI payment. Off the top of my head, I don't know what the legislation is for how far away from the neighbours, because generally speaking, most of them go actually in the middle of the garden, so they're about as far as away you can be from either one. That's something that I can check up on. But the other thing is, if you're worried about waking up the neighbours and other bits and bobs, I do believe Kath, we put the link on, didn't we, to the video of the working heat pump somewhere?
Yes, yeah, it's on the links page.
Right, so on the links page, that will take you through to the Busy Energy website, and you can actually see a video where he's commissioned a particular brand of heat pump, I think we will say, which is their low noise version. And I think that will show you just how low it is. Worst case is, if you've got people that are really unsure or unhappy about any noise, you can actually get an acoustic cover to go over the top of the heat pump with vents in it to then actually allow it to draw in air and leave air. But then it will also reduce the sound even more. But yeah, we'll check out on that to see if it's going to be a particular distance from neighbours.
Yeah, that might be in the permitted development conditions, but we'll have a look and we'll include that in our follow-up email. Another question from Martin. We were talking about this earlier. Warren. Are there issues with air source heat pump in coastal areas?
Oh, funny you should mention that. Whilst I was fact checking for the bits for this evening's presentation, there is, can I mention a brand name?
Go on.
Yeah, all right. Mitsubishi do a coastal version of their EcoDan heat pump. It's been specially designed, so the internal components are corrosive and rust resistant, particularly for use in coastal areas. And in fact, I downloaded the brochure for it, so we could even send that out with the questions that we do, or answers.
Yeah, we're not the BBC, Warren, don't worry. We can mention product names. Excellent, thank you. A question here from Margaret. We're looking into SunAmp heat batteries for our renovation. Do you have an opinion of them versus air source heat pump?
I'm not actually familiar with that brand. SunAmp heat batteries. Oh, I was at a innovation webinar just last week, and there was a product being shown there, which was a heat battery, a 3-ton container put in your handy outbuilding of the mansion, with water heated by solar thermal. I think there was a little bit of extra heat that actually went into the main container, and that was being used as an alternative to air source heat pumps. They're still at the prototype stage, so they've got one installed, and they're looking for other test houses to have. So I believe it seemed to be like quite a good system, and it all seemed to make sense with what the plans are. It was in a barrel that had a vacuum, much the same as the evacuated tube, and the temperature inside the barrel, I believe they were having it up to something like 300-400 degrees. And they were saying it would actually take nearly 2 weeks for it to cool down to then get to a temperature, say, where you can actually put your hand in and not take the skin off. They seemed to be quite happy that it was safe and it was doing a good job. But again, that was a prototype. I will check up on the SunAmp batteries and we'll include that in reply. I'll give you an independent opinion as to what I think. Generally speaking, there's no reason why you can't use another secondary device with any form of air source heat pump. There was, about 10 years ago, a flurry to try and preheat air before it went into air source heat pumps in order to reduce the energy even more. However, I haven't actually seen a product that has actually worked yet. So how the SunAmp ties in with the air source heat pump, I'm not sure. But I'll have a look and yeah, we'll render an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, Neil's just put a comment here and then saying SunAmp batteries can be used alongside air source heat pump. But I think you say, Warren, not familiar with it, so we can take a look and give a little bit more information in the follow-up email. I think there's one more question here that I can see from Andy. What are the maintenance requirements for heat pumps?
Ideally, a yearly service. Just making sure that the external unit is kept clean, from debris. If you have the yearly service, the engineer will come around, make sure that it's all cleaned out thoroughly. It will check all the working parts on the heat pump itself. It's really, consider it to be much the same as a traditional gas boiler. Ideally, they should be serviced as gas fires should be serviced every year. Just consider that part of the maintenance routine, and it should just keep going and going. Oh, and I must hasten to add, do make sure that you fully understand the control units for the air source heat pumps, how they work, and also to ensure that whoever has installed it so it's going to work at the right temperatures at the right times and everything else while you're there. Fortunately, the newer control units are a lot easier to understand. And I think a number of them now actually have an app that can be used on a smartphone or a tablet as well, which will make it even easier. And I say that from having had 3 engineers in one office trying to work out how to use the 20-year-old heat pump control.
Okay, well, that's all the questions that we've got in the chat, and that's just taking us up to 8 o'clock. So I think we'll wrap it up there. But if anybody does think of any questions after the event, by all means, you can respond to the follow-up email that we send out, or you can contact us at, via our website. We're Warmer Sussex at retrofitworks.co.uk. So thank you everybody for joining. I hope you found the information really useful. I've certainly always learn a lot when I'm listening to Warren. So thanks, Warren, for your time and for stepping in at the last minute. We do appreciate that.
Oh, thank you everyone for having me.
And thank you everybody for joining. Thank you. Good night.
All right, good night, everyone.